The galactic assassin Karasu Tabito goes one-on-one against the producer of destruction Hiori, a battle between two of the smartest players in the show. But also this is a fight with a long-standing history that dates to even before the inception of Blue Lock. And so you already know it. In today's video we are going to look at their stats, abilities and explore their best feats to determine who is the true dominator of Blue Lock. Hiori, Isegi's right-hand man, one of the coolest, most easygoing characters in Blue Lock, which is actually saying a lot considering just how much craziness goes around him in the show. But we can talk about his mentality when we get to his playing style. First, and as always, we gotta start with his physical stats. And straight up, I gotta say it is a little bit weird with Hiori. You see, at first glance, nothing really is special about him. He doesn't dominate any area, nor is he well-rounded like Ryo, Sai or Ren. However, a deeper look would tell you that Hiori has perfect genetics for sports. Meaning, for the very least, we know he is as good as it gets without getting into the realm of geniuses like Ren. But also this means that his body is intrinsically great at football. And this actually is reflected more into his technicality, natural tendencies and approach to the sports, more than it is just pure physicality. And in fact, this leads us straight into talking about his abilities and weapons. And if I said that it is a little bit weird with his physicality, it gets a whole lot weirder when we talk about his playing style, which is what we are going to start with, then we move to specific weapons he has. You see, Hiyori's whole existence is about calmly finding the most efficient, optimal and hard to defend against play. And this gets a little bit weird when we look at it from the perspective of a talented learner against a genius. You see, Hiori definitely is a talented learner. I mean, for the most parts, he clearly thinks and acts as one. However, in a lot of moments, he impulsively knows what's the right thing to do, without actually giving it much thought like talented learners usually do. For example, his final pass in the PXG game, he did not even know who would be receiving that pass, because he just went for the most optimal and rational spot, ignoring what striker could and how he might reach that pass. And this is at the core of the issue. You see, he might seem as a talented learner, but he also has a lot of tendencies towards being a genius. And we can confirm this by the fact that he was born with perfect genetics for sports, meaning he kinda is the definition of a genius. However, his mind acts like that of a talented learner. And by the way, his dream and his aspiration is kind of a mix between the two. He aspires to produce the best striker in the world, which definitely seems as a talented learner trait. For example, we have Ryo, Ego and Snuffy. However, the way he goes about it is definitely that of a genius. He does not care about the striker specifically, but rather he just cares about the process of producing said striker. That's why he never really had an issue with playing for any striker. As long as they keep up with his best vision, Hiori is totally fine with any striker, whether be it Isegi, Nagi, Ren, Shido or Kaiser. Hiori simply doesn't care. And in fact, this is at the core of his playing style and what makes Hiori unique of a midfielder. But before we explore what this means, first I wanna say this. You see, due to his technicality and natural affinity to the ball, coupled with his very calm demeanor in a show about egos, Hiori actually has a more natural inclination towards being a midfielder. I mean, despite having a very strong kick, his low tenacity wouldn't allow him to be as great of a striker as he would be as a midfielder. And that gotta be one of the most natural affinity in Blue Lock towards any other position other than a striker. For example, almost anyone else became a non-striker just so they can survive, whether be it Aryo, Chigiri or Karasu. A lot of players changed their goals just so they can survive. Hiori, on the other hand, discovered that his natural tendency is best suited for an attacking midfielder. And so, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what makes Hiori such a great midfielder, and also, as I said earlier, what makes him so unique. And for that, we are going to start with the weapons that actually defines this position, the passing ability. And immediately I gotta say, Hiori is probably the most unique passer in Blue Lock. And so what do I mean by that? Well, for starters, his passes with his left foot are one of the best in the show. They are extremely accurate, powerful and very elegant. However, they lack very much in versatility, especially when compared to Charles or Sai. However, and despite this, his passes, as I said, are still one of the best. They are very hard to deal with and have an insane trajectory. comparable to even that of Sai, meaning Hiori can always deliver a pass regardless of how far the striker is or if he is in an unfavorable position. However, don't let that fool you, because Hiori doesn't care about the striker at all. You see, from what we have seen, he only aims for the most optimal spot, ignoring the strikers, their weaknesses, their strong points. He just aims for the most efficient and most optimal spot on the pitch, meaning Hiori is completely different than Sai or Charles, whom we've seen them tailor their passes to their strikers, even when they are completely shit like Sendo. Hiyori's passes, on the other hand, are best suited for OP strikers with either insane finishing capabilities like Baro or Rin, insane field readability like Isagi, or hell, both like Kaiser. And if you think about it, this kinda makes him a premium midfielder. He only works with great strikers. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, this specifically is one of the best things about Hiori. You see, even though he seems that he does not care about the striker, this actually means that he takes a huge load off their backs, where they can totally focus on their craft and scoring capabilities, leaving the rest for Hiori to take care of it. And we've seen this with both Isagi and Kaiser in the PXG game. Before, Isagi needed to build the attack with either Yuki or Kurona. However, once Hiori hit the field, Isagi completely focused on scoring and became one of the best pure strikers in the show. And this kinda was the case for Kaiser as well. Once he teamed with Isagi and the beef is gone, Kaiser simply focused on finding the best spot, and Hiori surely met him there. That was a perfect transition from a midfielder to a striker, each focusing on their craft and meeting in the most optimal spots. And if we think about it, this kinda fits completely with his ego, because Hiori wants to be the one producing the best striker. Everything needs to be in his image, and so he only focuses on the most optimal spot in his eyes. And to me, this is exactly why I love Hiori and why he is one of the most interesting characters for me in the show. However, I gotta say, this playing style is not really without any weakness. You see, because he is aiming for the perfect, most optimal spot, the enemy defenders with insane field readability could also see the same spot, and they could counter Hiori very easily, like we've seen Karasu and Shido do. And for that reason, I would still love to see a little bit of versatility from him. Not necessarily to the level of Charles or Sai, but at least when needs be, Hiori could deliver different passes. Maybe ones that even go against the optimal play. However, I wouldn't dwell on it so much, because for a midfielder to produce the best passes for a striker, one needs more than just the passing ability. Sure, you could have the most beautiful passing ability. However, high quality teams won't just let you pass. I mean, Ness found that the hard way against Ubers and against PXG. And for that, the midfielder is actually required to have one of these two insane weapons. First, an insane perception and an overall great field awareness and readability. And second, an amazing dribbling ability. However, and much like Sai, Hiori actually presents both. First, let's talk about his perception. Well, ever since his introduction, Hiori was able to see the same as Rin and Isagi, but more impressively, he was able to see what Ubers were doing and how Baro was outside of everyone's vision twice, and in the second time, even Isagi and Kaiser were not able to see that, which means this is a perception feat comparable to Metavision users. In fact, Hiori is one of them. Hiori, of course, presents Metavision, and his, as I just stated, is actually one of the highest calibers, comparable even to the likes of Isagi and Kaisers. However, what's great about Hiori, or I should say what's unique about him, his perception doesn't just include metavision or field readability. In fact, Hiori presents an insane ability to understand the players, much like he does with the field. For example, we saw how after witnessing Rin play just once, he was able to match his playing style very effortlessly, where the likes of Isagi or Nanase, it took them a lot of times just for them to understand Rin. However, what I've always found to be more intriguing and more impressive is actually him after witnessing how Isagi is struggling to match Rin and Shido, he was able to immediately deduct what Isagi must do in order to reach them, whom due to that comment of doing it reflexively later subconsciously awakened his metavision. And of course, after that, we all know that he taught it to Hiori, everything coming full circle. However, and since we are talking about Hiori and Isagi's shared vision, we gotta talk about the reflex meeting reflex weapon. You see, when playing with Metavision users, and due to Hiori's impeccable ability to find the most optimal spot, Yo can deliver perfect passes without the need for eye contact, or hell, even without directly looking at his target. And as I said, this is perfect for strikers with insane field readability and perception. Like we've seen it of course happened with Kaiser and more impressively with Isagi. However, and regardless of this, perfect positioning and perception are not the only weapons that Hiori has that help him in penetrating and then delivering his passes. As next, of course, we gotta talk about his insane dribbling ability. While not being necessarily on the level of Bajira, Chigiri or Lorenzo, Hiyori's dribbling ability is one of the trickiest ones to deal with, and that's because much like Sai's, it is a reactive dribbling. However, and instead of changing the direction or the dribbling moves, Hiori is actually all about changing the tempo or pacing of his dribbles to react to what his opponents are doing, which to be honest in the NEL proved to be one hell of a dribbling ability, especially since Hiyori's end goal is not really to penetrate like Bajira or Rin, but rather it is just to give himself the space necessary to deliver one of his signature passes. And if you think about it, it fits perfectly with his playing style. Hiori first scans the fields to determine what is the most optimal play. He then finds the perfect position from where he can deliver the pass. And finally, he keeps changing the tempo of his dribble so he can shake off the player marking him and then deliver the ball to the striker. And honestly, Hiori seems as a complete package. Every weapon that he has fits perfectly with his playing style, making him one of the greatest attacking midfielders in the show. However, can the Zombie Slayer actually slay the assassin? The Crow Father, Karasu Tabito. One of the smartest players in Blue Lock, capable of even operating on the highest of levels when it comes to pure intelligence. However, and before we talk about his big brain and what abilities it enables him to have, as I said before, we always gotta start with his physical stats. Now for Karasu, he is slightly above average. I mean, for jumping and speed, nothing really special there. However, he has a slightly above average physicality and insanely long limbs that enable him to have an insane reach, which thanks to his brain he utilizes to the fullest. And so without any further ado, let's move to his abilities and weapons. And immediately let's talk about the weapon that his insane reach and above average physicality enables him. You see, unlike other players with insane reach like Aryu or Kunigami, Karasu utilizes this ability of his very differently, and probably far more effectively than both, as this gives him probably one of the best dueling ability in the show. And because Karasu is a talented learner, this weapon did not just come from his abilities. In fact, it was his big brain that actually enabled it. You see, Karasu has probably one of the best hand placement in the show, maybe second only to Kaiser. And this is actually saying a lot, because Kaiser is not really that strong physically. However, he is probably one of the hardest strikers to engage, just due to how perfect his hand placement is. And in this area, Karasu is definitely on that level, and they are only rivaled by the likes of Rin and other insane geniuses. And I gotta say, for his dueling ability on defense, Karasu probably has the third best dueling ability we've seen in the show, right behind Aiku and Lorenzo. However, where I think he shines more with this ability is actually on offense. As you see, for Karasu's playing style that requires a lot of analysis and a lot of time for reading the field and the players, this hand placement and dueling ability gives him what's probably the best ball retention in the show, if we exclude of course the dribblers. And as I said, this fits perfectly with his playing style, because it actually gives him the time to read the situation. And when you couple this with his insane brain, it actually enables him to be the beating heart of every team he plays for, whether be it PXG, Japan Under 20 or the Blue Lock 11 team. Karasu always finds himself as the beating heart of any team he plays for. However, and as I mentioned, it's not really just due to this dueling ability. In fact, I think his greatest weapon is his tactical brain. You see, while other smart players like his opponent today, Hiori, Isagi or Kaiser, all play for the sake of finding the most optimal route, Karasu's whole playing style is about designing the most tactical play in order for the team to score, making him again the best beating heart for any team. And by the way, if I am not making it clear enough, this means that Karasu really fits in any system, simply because due to his tactical vision, he will be able to get the best of any situation or any team he plays for, making him one of the most, if not the most versatile player we've seen in the show. Maybe only Snuffy is better than him in this regard. Speaking of Mark Snuffy, the latter excels in discovering latent talents in his players, which is actually a weapon that we've seen Karasu present. And in fact, what started this whole rivalry between him and Hiori is specifically this power of his, where he was able to figure out rather quickly that Hiori is depressed when he is playing football. but more impressively, him discovering Isegi's insane reactive talent earlier than anyone. I mean, with the exception of Ego, Karasu was the first to pinpoint Isegi's true talent. And again, this means that Karasu can fit in any system, not only because he can design the most tactical play for the team, but also Karasu excels at driving the best out of his teammates and the worst out of his opponents, again like he did with Isegi. However, his insane perception doesn't end with matching players and understanding them. In fact, Karasu presents one of the best field readability in the show, and subsequently he also presents the best vision in Blue Lock, which is Metavision. You see, Karasu is one of only 2 players who attain Metavision completely subconsciously. Unlike, for example, Isegi, who attained it subconsciously only for a few moments, Karasu and Ryo are the only 2 players who were shown to attain Metavision subconsciously and then keep it for the remainder of the show. And I gotta say, I just love this, because it kinda hints at how, for example, Charles or Kaza attained this vision. However, and going back to Karasu, his Metavision is definitely one of the highest calibers, as immediately after attaining it, he was able to play on Isegi and Kaza's level. In fact, if it wasn't for him, Isegi would have ended PXG as soon as he teamed up with Kaza. And later we've seen how he started controlling everything from the shadows, giving both Rin and Shido the space they need in order to shine. However, even before Metavision, Karasu's insane field readability, his insane intelligence and tactical play, coupled with his insane perception and ball keeping and retention abilities, he was able to be the backbone to PXG, giving Charles the space he needed in order to feed Shido and Rin the passes they desire. And in fact, even recently against Nigeria, we are seeing the likes of Isegi and Ryo change the way they play simply because Karasu is on the field. You see, because he knew Karasu would stop Onaji, Isegi in a very uncharacteristic move actually pressed on head-on, where usually he stays in the shadow and shows up in the last moment. However, because he understands that Karasu got his back, he definitely went and pressed Kuso. And honestly, this is one of the most beautiful double feats, both for Karasu because he is the backbone, but also for Isegi who completely understands his team. And overall, this is specifically what makes Karasu one of the best players in Blue Lock. He simply is one of the best players to rely on in any given situation. However, can the assassin actually assassinate the producer of the show? For how this matchup will go, I gotta say it is pretty close. I mean, to be honest, despite what the title might say, I will not be doing any matchup if it is not close. However, this fight specifically, I find it to be really interesting, because both Hiori and Karasu excel very well in what they do, and given how different their positions are, they are kinda the best at what they do, right behind the new Gen 11s. And of course for Hiori, he is right behind Charles as well. However, and despite them being the best at what they do, we gotta look at who is overall better. In any given situation, who is more valuable to any given team. Now, at first glance, it is definitely Hiori, right? I mean, he could keep feeding the forward line a perfect pass after a perfect pass after a perfect pass. And that's definitely very valuable for any team. Karasu, on the other hand, excel in tactically building an attack where the striker is more likely to score. And also, and I gotta say this, Karasu fits better with almost any team, unlike Hiori, who sometimes is a premium midfielder and even require great strikers in order to shine. And I mean, that's not really a weakness. Even Sai could not shine as a midfielder because Sendo and the rest were really shitty. And only when Shido joined the battle that we got to witness how crazy Sai is of a midfielder. And I feel like Hiori kinda fits in the same boat, albeit he is more extreme than Sai. Karasu, on the other hand, is all about being the most versatile player ever and being valuable to almost any team or any situation, whether be it insane war at the highest of levels or even weak teams. And even when we look at their playing styles, I always feel as if Karasu is one step ahead of Hiori. They are definitely close and even could be on the same level. However, I definitely see Karasu a step ahead of Hiori. First of all, when it comes to the dueling ability, Hiori's dribbling is definitely better than Karasu's ball keeping ability. However, Karasu shines because his dueling ability is great both on defense and or offense. And by the way, I gotta say this, even though Hiori could dribble past Karasu, there is actually no way for Hiori to take the ball from Karasu either. Then when we talk about their intelligence, while I see Hiori being one of the smartest players for sure, he is definitely not smarter than Karasu. I think in the U20 category, only Isegi is on Karasu's level when it comes to pure intelligence. However, where I think Hiori is better is actually with his approach and his ego. Hiori always has a clear goal in his mind. He always wants to produce the best striker. Karasu, on the other hand, we actually do not know why he fights. I mean, the best we've gotten is in the Nagi spin-off novel, where he was said to be an average person who excels at actually perceiving his surroundings. However, it actually never said anything for his ego. But we can assume that he has a very strong ego because he always is fired up and he is always trying to do his best. And in fact, in the PXG game, as I said, he was the one, in addition to Charles, who were keeping the team from falling apart. And by the way, this is all due to the incompetence of Loki. In any case, however, I think even though Hiyori's ego might be stronger, Karasu definitely has a strong ego. However, finally, let's talk about their tenacity and the way they carry themselves in the field. And here, I think Karasu beats Hiori by miles. In chapter 311, Isagi noticed that Hiori lacks the tenacity that he showed in the Uber's game, and that definitely was the case in the PXG game. After delivering one of the best performances in the NEL, Hiori completely died out in the PXG game. In fact, other than the 2 chances that he created for Isagi and Kaiser, Hiori did not do much, to be honest. Sure, he stopped Rin at first, but then he faded into obscurity. Karasu, on the other hand, he was everywhere doing everything at all time, whether be it at the start, in the middle, or at the end of the game. He definitely showed more tenacity and more will to fight than Hiori. And for that, and due to him being smarter, I think the mentality points go for Karasu. And as always, it is the determining factor for this matchup. Despite them being very close, I think Karasu's versatility, his tactical play, and overall better mentality would give him the W today. And by the way, from the looks of it and the conversation between Isagi and Hiori, it seems that Hiori still has room to grow. And so maybe in the future he could reach this level. However, for now, the winner is definitely Karasu. But that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.